everyone. Welcome to DM Tools with MaxMcCool. I'd like to start off just by thanking you all for tuning into my episodes. I hope that they've been useful and at the very least entertaining for you guys to tune in and listen to. And I hope that they've assisted you in kind of working out and strengthening those imagination muscles for all you DMs out there and potential DMs out there. So I figured this week I would do something a little bit different, and rather than provide you guys with another episode of Monsters Manifested, I thought it would be a good idea for me to give you guys a bit of an overview of the podcast and why I decided to start it out in the first place. So when I first started DMing, which was probably about, between 7 and 9 years ago, something like that, so let's call it 8, I found it kind of difficult for me to discover resources that were beneficial in helping me kind of work out my adventures and my imagination and my creativity, specifically in the way of kind of pacing out an adventure and implementing certain encounters and what would fit and what wouldn't fit. And although I had the player's handbook and the dungeon master's guide and the monster manual, I had all of the kind of staple resources that any dungeon master has. I found it a little bit difficult to go through the tables and come up with something random and have, 3 or 4 encounters generated, or, the beginning, the middle, and the end to my adventure, and kind of tying it all together. So what I decided to do, what I found that worked really well for me, was I would go into the monster manual and I would find a monster that was kind of within reason of the difficulty or challenge to my players, depending on what level they were. And I would use that monster or that creature as kind of the focal point of my adventure, right? They would be the final boss, if you would. And what I would do is I would kind of pepper other cool and interesting, maybe less difficult monsters and creatures into the adventure as well, just to kind of mix it up. Now, I started out by trying to have creatures that would kind of lead into the larger creature, where it would make sense, and, that these creatures or these monsters would be working alongside or working for this, major villain that my players were going to go up against at the climax of the adventure. So as I got a bit more skilled and a bit more confident in my development of these adventures and kind of setting these scenarios up, I decided to mix it up a little bit, right? And I would throw in some random creatures, mix and match, or I would change the environment. Maybe I would go from, let's say, your typical wooded area, your forested area, and suddenly somewhere in the forest there's a cave. And when they go into the cave, the environment changes, and due to the fact of the change of the environment, you have a change in the wildlife or creatures that inhabit that kind of area, right? And that would kind of help my adventure give a bit of reasoning to why there's these strange combinations of encounters. Now, as I kept at it and kind of kept working on the craft, it became a little bit easier and became a bit more natural for me to bring these things together. And it wasn't until I got to the point where I started feeling pretty comfortable with what I was doing there in the way of mix and matching monsters that seemingly wouldn't fit together in an adventure and kind of hammering them into one session. It was only once this happened that I decided I was going to look into these monsters and see what they were all about, right? So initially, I would just see a creature in the monster manual. I would go, that thing looks really cool. It has some cool abilities. I wonder how my players would go up against it. It went from that to being, well, this creature is cool. Now, what's it all about? What's the background? What's the environment? And I started reading into the lore. And then what I would do is I would find another creature, maybe a lower CR creature or something that was more of like a mob type creature that runs in packs or groups. And I would read their lore and their information. And I would go, okay, so this initial creature, this big monster, let's say, lives here, has this kind of behavior, tends to operate in a certain manner. And these creatures, these smaller creatures that I'd like to use as minions, operate pretty differently. Now, where and how can I create a tie, these two threads together in order to rationalize why this villain, why this main evil climatic villain for my adventure this week, why they are working with or conscripting these lesser monsters to work for them, or do their bidding and stuff like that. And as that went on, I got a little bit better as, the weeks and many, many years went on. And eventually what ended up happening was it became pretty natural for me. But that's not why I started this podcast. The reason why I started this podcast was because when I was first starting out, it was kind of difficult for me to figure out how to work all of these things together, to figure out what pattern and what kind of flow worked for me. And I found that although there's a ton of resources, which there are, between the official books, modules, the user submitted adventures and mods and all sorts of, treasure tables and traps tables and all that stuff that you can find online, like at DM's Guild and stuff like that. All of that stuff seemed to, for me at least, have this kind of rigidity to it, where if I started to consume all of these resources and take them in and try to implement them, I would kind of cripple myself in that I felt compelled to not stray away from what they were providing me with. So it kind of became a bit more of a hindrance to me and my DMing capabilities rather than a help. Because although the information was there and a lot of it was really useful and interesting, it kind of held me back from tying things together in my adventure. Or I'd say, I'd really like it if this happened, or, it'd be cool if I could implement this encounter with this adventure, but I don't know if it'll work. I don't think it will, because this adventure, this module is designed to kind of progress a certain way. And if I throw this in, was it going to muck up the flow of the campaign or the adventure or what's going on? And that apprehension would lead me to kind of have these stiff and stilted adventures, even though all of it was provided for me. So one of the things I really wished I could find and never could was just some resources that would provide the dungeon master with some examples with creatures and what they could do and how they could be utilized and what their standard order of operation is, right? In terms of where they live, what their behavior patterns are, whether or not they find followers or, devotees or slaves, or maybe they can summon minions and stuff like that, whether or not they're highly chaotic and destructive, whether they're more kind of elusive and prefer to use subterfuge and stuff like that. And there was nothing quite like that, where it was just like, okay, well, for example, I see that here's some orcs. Here's orcs. I'd like to put orcs in my adventure, but I don't know how orcs behave. I don't know what kind of society they have. Do they follow any sort of law? Are they just these chaotic, nomadic, tribal type individuals that come in and pillage and burn down everything in their path? Do they have a sort of structure? Are orcs capable of being intelligent in the way that perhaps like a scholarly wizard might be, stuff of that nature? So what I ended up doing was I ended up reading into them, and then once I understood how they operated, I would mutate it, as I said before. But none of that really existed. So I thought that it would be a pretty interesting and useful resource to have something where people could listen to these ideas, which are really just a stream of consciousness. It's just a flow of ideas that come to me that they could use at least as food for thought when trying to design an encounter. And though the episode that you folks tune into might not necessarily be of the monster that you are going to implement in your next session, at least that kind of creative pondering, let's call it, as to how you could implement and establish certain creatures and monsters into your adventure could be useful, in that it could be applicable to what you're doing, although it's not directly related, right? So that's why I decided to start out this podcast with the Monsters Manifested. Additionally, I decided to start out with Monsters Manifested because for all the years I've been DMing, I haven't gone through the entirety of the Monster Manual or the expanded manuals like, Volo's Guide and Xanathar's, or sorry, not Xanathar's, Mordenkainen's. Though I've I own all of them and I've used them for years in my games, I haven't gone through them cover to cover, which means I haven't read the information on every single creature that's there. So what I thought would be a pretty cool challenge would be for me to go through these monster books and read through them from A to Z and go through every single creature, read up on their lore and learn some stuff about their nature and how they behave and interact with your players, with each other, with other enemies, stuff like that. And not only learn more about the creatures in D&D, but also kind of challenge myself to develop off the cuff, off the top of my head, these adventures, or it's scenarios really, that I could use or the listeners could use and plop into their game however they see fit. And I think that it's pretty beneficial to both yourselves and myself in that you folks get some information on a creature that you might be interested in, maybe some ideas as to how you could implement certain creatures in your adventures with your players. And I get to continue exercising those imaginary muscles, those imagination muscles. Perhaps they are imaginary, but regardless, I get a chance to work out those muscles and be able to quickly develop some encounters or scenarios with creatures, which is beneficial to anyone who'd like to DM, because it is inevitable that you're going to have to develop some encounters or some scenarios or some combat or some anything really on the fly at any point in time. Eventually it will come up. So I figured it would be kind of doubly beneficial in that you folks could get something to listen to that hopefully is interesting and is at the very least informative, so that you can have some ideas to work with as you develop your adventures. And it's beneficial on this end because I'm then able to read through all of this information and exercise those imagination muscles and develop these things on the fly, which can only benefit myself in terms of my dungeon mastering, right? So that's basically it. That was about all I had in mind, and I hope to continue this along. Right now, I can only really post maybe 1 or 2 episodes a week, and, life happens, so things get busy and doesn't always work out, but I do my best to provide you guys with at least 1 episode a week, and I'll continue to do so unless stated otherwise, I suppose. But yeah, that's it for this week. Just wanted to thank you all again and let you know what my idea was for this podcast and why I chose to start it out with the Monsters Manifested series. So thank you very much once again for tuning in. It's highly, highly appreciated. And next week, we'll be covering animated objects. I think I might do the animated objects similarly to how I did the Angels episodes. I might split them up into a couple of episodes, but that might not even be necessary because animated objects seem to cover 2 pages, and I believe there's 3 types of animated objects that the Monster Manual provides. So it might just be a single episode covering all 3 forms of animated objects. I'm thinking I might try maybe a haunted house style scenario with those where I could implement all of them. Might be pretty cool for you. But either way, thanks again for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good day, everybody.